In 1927, in spite of my father's fierce opposition, I moved to Paris to complete my studies in music. My hope at the time was to study with Ravel, but he wasn't giving lessons then. I was feeling rather undecided when, during those rainy days in November, they put on at the Opéra Comique a work by Paul Dukas, Ariane et Barbe Bleue. I felt great enthusiasm for the composer's sparkling symphonic poem, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and I made haste to go to the small attractive theatre that I hadn't been to as yet. Came out absolutely thrilled, and immediately decided to work with Dukas if he would accept me as a student. During that time I met the Hispanist Henri Collet, and it was he who gave me a letter of introduction to Dukas, who gave classes in composition at the Conservatoire and the École Normale de Musique. What emotions I felt as I approached his house in Passy, not far from the Bois de Boulogne. I remember that when I asked the concierge for Dukas, a rather short man, with a large umbrella, which he was never without, and sporting a thick beard, was coming out of the doorway, and he replied, "That's me." With great embarrassment I explained what I wanted as best I could in my limited French, and I thought I understood him to say that I should go upstairs with him. An old house, very narrow staircase, spirals you'd expect, a very simple flat, a small study, and in it an old piano, some rugs, a fire that didn't give out much heat, many scores, and a large number of books. And that's when I became aware of his French, which it took me months to understand, muffled by his beard and spoken in a dull, almost hoarse voice. But I thought I understood him to say that I should go and see him at the École Normale de Musique, and that I should bring with me some of my works. And that's what I did. Paul Dukas was a rather distant man, not given to praise, austere, but fair in his judgments. He was sharp, but not sarcastic, and there was something affectionate about him that came from a person who was essentially a shy man, whose ideal was the search for truth, for what was authentic. The classroom was spacious, this time with a grand piano where the maestro was seated, surrounded by some composers whom I knew, among them Roland Manuel and the Mexican Manuel Ponce, with both of whom I became firm friends. There was also a small group of students, almost all of them foreign, some of whom were pianists. I happily went through the nerve-wracking audition, and months later, I can say without false modesty, that I was his favourite student. Thanks to his help, I was able to publish a good number of my compositions, to my great surprise. I remember he said to me, "Rodrigo, when you go to see a publisher, don't forget they don't accept any old thing." The following year, again with his help, I was able to have the premiere of my first symphonic composition, Cinco Piezas Infantiles, given by the Straram Orchestra, the most prestigious in Paris at the time. I completed 5 years in his classes, and after that, my wife, for whom Dukas felt great affection, my wife and I used to sit in on his classes until 1935, the year he died from a heart attack, when he just reached his 70th year. I recall that weeks before he'd had his first serious heart attack, and when I phoned him to ask how he was, he replied, "Don't worry, not this time." Unfortunately, it happened the next time. The classes, which took place twice a week and lasted 2 hours, were divided into 2 parts. The first hour was for correcting compositions. The second, which interested me more, was for analysis. And at the piano, with me beside him, he would interpret symphonies, chamber works, operas, etc. His judgments were swift, assured, original, based on great knowledge, and his wisdom was far-reaching. He knew practically all music, and his opinions were always impartial, although I once heard him say, when asked if he liked Tchaikovsky, "I avoid listening to him." As a composer, he suffered from his own self-criticism. The rigorousness that was the basis of his whole life accentuated this and led him to burn his unpublished works before he died, just as he himself was cremated. while Marcel Dupré played on the organ those Bach chorales that Dukas had analysed so many times. The Sorcerer's Apprentice and the ballet La Pairie assure him a place among the foremost symphonists of our century. His orchestration is an example of how light pointillisme can be sustained by firm composition. His harmonies, based on augmented fifths, sevenths and ninths, weave the richest of canvases out of an individual voice. And at a time when Impressionism seemed to be everywhere, his masterpiece, the opera Ariane Barbleu, is like a meeting of the ideals of a Wagner and a Debussy. The heroine, Ariana, represents his ideals as a man and as a musician, the determined, constant search for the truth, for justice, in gentleness and firmness.